research field. The industry salutes these efforts and is indebted to their service.
I'm Lois Timms-Ferrara. I'm here today with my colleague Mark Maynard from the Roper Center Public Opinion Archives at the University of Connecticut. And we're here today as part of the Heritage Program of the American Association for Public Opinion Research to interview Burns W. Roper, more affectionately known as Bud Roper. And today we're going to start out by asking Mr. Roper some questions about his career in survey research. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about Bud. He was born on February 26, 1925 in Creston, Iowa, to Dorothy and Elmo Burns Roper. Bud was in the Air Force during World War II, and then he spent a significant amount of his career in survey research, starting
48 years.
48 years in survey research. He started out with Elmo Roper and Associates in the fall of 1946, and then he went on to become chairman of the Roper Organization and Roper Starch. When he retired in 1994, he moved here to lovely Cape Cod, Mass. Bud has had an illustrious career, including several posts in the AAPOR community. In 1967 through 1970, and again in 1979 through 80, he was council member at large. In 1980 and 81, Bud held the position of Associate Standards Chair. And in 1981-82, he became vice president. The following year, in 1982, he became president of AAPOR. Bud is an honorary life member, and he was the recipient of the prestigious AAPOR Award in 1988. Bud is also a member of the Board of Trustees for the National Council on Public Polls. And he is a director and had been chairman of the Roper Center Board of Directors from 1970 through 1994. During that time, he also taught in a master's program in survey research at the University of Connecticut. He taught both graduate and undergraduate courses and has helped shape those existing and new survey researchers today. We're going to start, Bud, by asking you a couple of questions from the beginning. In your youth, you became a pilot in the 8th Air Force in World War II European theater operations, flying B-17 missions for the U.S. Air Force. You've also studied architecture while at Yale. You had a strong interest in the labor movement. How was it that you came to settle in on survey research for your career?
Well, actually, I didn't study architecture at Yale. That would have made the decision easier. I did it by process of elimination. I was intrigued with the idea of being a labor leader, but during the war, I decided that the labor movement had pretty much accomplished what it had set out to do, and it was at the point where it was doing as much harm as good. And I decided I didn't want to be a part of that kind of a mixed picture. So I narrowed it down to architecture and public opinion research. Architecture intrigued me, still does, but I didn't get along very well with Yale. The first 2 years I went there, and the prospect of going there for a total of 5 years to become an architect was more than I could take. So I sort of, in that sense, backed into public opinion research. I don't mean I took my third choice. That was the one choice left out of the 3 I started with, because I ruled out labor and architecture.
Can you tell us a little bit about your first career in the Air Force?
Well, yeah, I'd be happy to. I've only had two paying jobs in my life other than summer jobs. And one of them was with the Army Air Corps, and the other was with Roper. I think the two careers were probably equally important, very different but equally important. I think I did them in the right order. Had to save this country and the free world first before opinion research had any relevance anyway. And I very proud of my 35 missions in the 8th Air Force. But I don't want to get started on specific missions because about a year or year and a half ago, I spoke on one mission and the talk was 40 minutes long. That was without questions and answers. It was an exciting career. It was probably more dangerous than public opinion research, but at the time it was more important than public opinion research. But they've both been exciting careers, and I know this is basically for AAPOR, so I'm going to focus on the public opinion side rather than the flyboy side of it.
Did you ever consider commercial airline work?
Yeah, I did, but I didn't like being told when I was going to fly, what I was going to fly, where I was going to fly. Mm-hmm. I didn't like it in the Air Force. I didn't like the prospect of it in commercial airlines. I figured I'll do some private flying. But at that time, I couldn't afford it either in time or money, and I figured, well, I'll wait till I get more time and more money, and then I'll do it. Of course, by the time I got more time and more money, I had a heart condition, and I couldn't get a license anyway. So much for my private flying.
You came back from World War II, your World War II experience, and started at the firm in the fall of '46.
Well, I came back, I went back to Yale for the second year, and it was no better than the first year. So I finally won my case with the dean and had 2 years credit, and I quit and went to work with the firm.
In an interview with your father back in 1968, he discussed the role of survey research in the military during the war effort, and he also makes reference to how important that military survey research those efforts were for the maturation of the industry, for the growth of the industry and development. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe, and also what the state of the industry was when you started at the firm in '46 when you got back?
Well, I think on the first research I know of that was used for policy purposes in the government was the research that we did and that George Gallup did. I say we, I wasn't in the firm then, it was my father. And George Gallup did for FDR. FDR he was trying to get us involved before Britain went down the tubes and we were the last line of defense. The first line of defense instead of the last. And so he wanted to see how fast he could move with public opinion. He knew public opinion was not in favor of involvement, but he asked us if we could do something on the Lend-Lease program, and he asked Gallup the same thing. Gallup didn't know he'd asked us. We didn't know he'd asked Gallup, but he did, and my father got approval from Henry Luce, to put questions on the Fortune survey, which we were doing at that time, and to give them advanced results to the White House. And that's what we did. And that's what, I don't know just how George Gallup did it, but they did the same thing. Well, that, Roosevelt didn't have prestige with everyone, but he had an awful lot of prestige. And if he was using opinion surveys, that couldn't do any harm. And then during World War II, my father was instrumental in getting the Army, Eisenhower specifically, the Navy, and the Air Force, as it was then known, to adopt opinion research, largely for morale studies, to find out how the soldiers or the sailors or whatever were reacting to what they were being told and asked to do, and so on and so forth. Now, the state of the industry when I came into it. Well, it was someplace between a kooky, off-the-wall idea and an established industry. It was the three elections, the 1936 election, the 1940 election, and the 1944 election, all of which preceded my getting into it, had done a lot to establish the idea that maybe there is something to this sampling, because those three surveys had been the most accurate. Ours was the most accurate, and much more accurate than the Literary Digest, which used millions of ballots, where we were all dealing in what then seemed like small numbers, 5,000 interviews. Now we seldom do anything that big, but then it was 5,000 interviews. And they had all correctly picked FDR as the winner. So that had helped give it some stature. But you still found an awful lot of people that said, I just don't believe you can tell what a country of 130 million thinks with only 5,000 interviews. You still get it somewhat, but nothing like we did. And then there were all kinds of raging. The field was peopled by people who were in various far-flung fields. I mean, Arch Crossley was a copywriter for an ad agency. That was his background. George Gallup had done some polling at the University of Iowa, mostly for his mother-in-law, who was picked as the fall girl to run on the Democratic ticket in a strongly Republican state at that time. And thanks to her and to George, she won. And that sort of got him involved in political polling. My father was a retail jeweler who went broke, not in 29, but before 29. He always says he made the mistake of trying to run a Tiffany-like operation in a non-Tiffany town. That's Creston, Iowa. And so it was, and you got Paul Lazarsfeld, who was speaking with an accent that was almost unintelligible from Austria. You had all kinds of other people from different backgrounds coming into it, and all thinking their background was the salvation and the future of opinion research. So it was a bit of a chaos, but established chaos.
Mm-hmm. Were there any syndicated columns at that point? The pollsters, did they have some syndicated columns? 1946,
Gallup
47?
was syndicated for his public opinion polls, and we were not syndicated, but we had the, well, we were at one point. We had the Fortune Quarterly Survey that we did for Fortune magazine.
When did that start? When did that start?
That was, the first one was in 35, early 35. And incidentally, if you ever find that issue and read about how the survey was done, it is the best description I have ever read, including ones written today. And it was published in June of 35 in Fortune magazine. Very good.
What was unique about the description?
Well, for one thing, it spoke in English instead of jargon. And it talked about building a model of the whole with the sample. I mean, it made sampling sort of come alive. Not how you do it, but why it works. And it was
That's great.
very good.
Can you describe for us the operation of the firm at the time and what it was like working with your father?
Well, when I joined the firm, I think we had about a full-time staff of about 35 to 40 people. Then we had a part-time interviewing staff. We had interviewers all over the country. Something like 100 different sampling points. And these people were personally hired and trained by our regional supervisors, but they worked on an hourly basis. That when I say 35 to 40, I mean people who were on a full-time payroll. We probably were about as big as anyone then, except for people who were sort of in related fields like A.C. Nielsen. I don't know how big Gallup was then. Well, that's pretty much it. I think I've answered your question.
Yeah, who were the key senior staff at that time? Sorry.
Obviously, my father was. Carolyn Crucius, who always has taken great delight and says she worked for the firm longer than my father did, which is true, because she was the secretary and Girl Friday to a guy named Paul Charrington. And Paul Charrington, the original firm was Charrington, Roper, and Wood. And it came about because my father had this idea of getting out to the grassroots where the decisions are made, to try and put the decisions management was coming to in perspective. And he talked to Richardson Wood about it. Richardson Wood then was account supervisor or something for one of the companies my father worked for after the jewelry business failed and before he went into opinion research. And I remember my father saying, Richardson Wood said, "So you want to get into marketing research?" And my father said, "That's the first time I had ever heard the words." And anyway, Dick Wood suggested they set up a meeting with another luncheon meeting with the two of them and Paul Charrington, who had quite a big reputation. He was at the Harvard Business School. And out of that lunch came the firm of Charrington, Roper, and Wood. Then, in addition to Carolyn Crucius, there was Einar Anderson was one of the partners and project directors. It was all a partnership at that time. Julian Woodward was another one of them. Bob Williams was another one. He was more on the administrative side, but he was in the top brass. And that was pretty much it, as I remember it. There were others that were in and out, but those were the ones that were in it for a long time.
What was your role in the firm when you first started?
My role?
Position.
Well, it was doing a little of this and a little of that and a little of the other thing. It was heavily on-the-job training, but we had a team set up. For example, I might work with one of the partners, Carolyn Crucius, let's say, on the XYZ account. So I was her personal assistant on any studies we did for that account. Then I might also be an assistant to Einar Anderson on another account, specifically the Tea Bureau, where we were trying to find out why more Americans didn't drink tea and what could be done to get them to drink tea. And the other research assistants, as we were called, were similarly assigned to this partner or that partner on this account or that account. And it was doing a little, I mean, I got to the point where I'd start out and somebody would say, "Well, why don't you write the questions on subject X?" And it got to the point where saying, "Why don't you write the first draft of the questionnaire?" And then I'd go out and test it, go out to Queens usually, and get off the subway and come up with someplace and start knocking on doors and trying out the questionnaire and seeing whether people understood it, whether it seemed to be getting the kinds of information we were seeking. And then I would build codes or supervise the building of codes for our coding department for the open-ended stuff. And I would do the tab specs. Now we got all this data, what are we going to do with it? And I got into the point ultimately of taking first cracks at writing an analysis. And ultimately, as I moved up out of that assistant role, I was a partner in my own right, that I had made presentations and I was involved in the basic formulation of the study design, whatever it was, whatever seemed like it would solve the client's problem. So that was the way it was being an assistant on everything. Which I think is a good way of learning the field. You're learning with somebody who knows it. You're being given a certain amount of, and of course some partners would give you more flexibility than others. Some would give you the whole thing because it was an area that they didn't feel comfortable with. So by default, you'd be in charge of whatever it was. Some held you to a fairly tight leash and others didn't.
Right.
And you'd work with different partners who all had different strengths and weaknesses. So it gives you a pretty rounded picture of what the problems were and how to deal with them. I think it was a great setup. So that's what I did.
I was interested in that. We have survey research graduate programs at Connecticut, Michigan, and Nebraska, and it sounds like you were talking about on-the-job training, and it sounds like you were involved with a lot of different things in a lot of different areas, but really reporting to a variety of senior people, but it was really on the job. There was no course. There was no.
No, it was, well, you had a little of that. For example, we had a consulting statistician named Ray Franzen, and Ray would come, I forget, 2 or 3 times a year and give presentations to the researchers about sampling methodology, and so we had some of that, but it was more on the job than anything else, and it was one-to-one with the partner, or sometimes a project was so big it would have 2 or 3 assistants on it, so it'd be 2 or 3 and they'd have to figure out how to carve it up so that they weren't all duplicating each other. But I think it was a great way to do it. And we I guess were relatively unique. We did not hire special. We did not have we had a statistician, but we only had one, and he was available to any team. We didn't have a psychology department. We didn't have a marketing department. We didn't have. It wasn't done that way. It was done with the idea that any problem that talking with the right people about in the right way could solve, that's what we did. And if that involved marketing, fine. If it involved psychology, so be it. And put it together that way.
Sounds very pragmatic.
It was pragmatic, but that's one of the reasons I think it was good. And I learned more theory than a lot of my colleagues did because I was interested in it. And they weren't particularly. I had a partner, not a partner, but a person, this is later, the example I'm thinking of, and I shall not name him. He just ruled out sampling. Mathematics wasn't his area, and somebody else will have to do that. And I keep saying, look, you can't be a full researcher if you don't know how to put a sample together, or at least tell somebody how you want it put together. And because I've done some pretty sophisticated and complicated samples. Whether I've done them to Warren Matofsky standards, I don't know, but I've done them.
So about the time that you joined the firm, AAPOR was starting up. The association
Right.
was beginning. Did you participate in some of those early meetings?
I came into the firm in September of '46. The forerunner meeting to AAPOR was put together by,
Harry.
trying to think of his name, out in Colorado.
Harry Field? Harry Field?
Harry Field. And it really wasn't an AAPOR meeting, but Harry Field was apparently, I never met the man, I'm sorry to say. He's the one person in the field that I've always wished I knew, but never did. He died in a plane crash. I think it was in August, or maybe it was late July of '46, just before I joined the firm, so I never met him. But he was concerned about the fact that academia had nothing but contempt for commercial researchers, and commercial researchers had nothing but contempt for academia. People who spend years and years analyzing 3 interviews and coming up with a set of findings that by that time is so obvious that you didn't need even 3 interviews to know it. That kind of an attitude. And he handpicked the people he wanted to come to this meeting. My father was one, Arch Crosley was one, George Gallup was one, but he had similar people on the academic side. And it took place in Central City, Colorado. And it's now known widely through the field as the Central City meeting. It took place in '46. It was in the works, I guess, in late '45 or early '46, but it actually took place in, I forget, June or something like that. And it was the forerunner to AAPOR. It was aimed at creating an organization that would bring these 2 rather intolerant, warring factions together and get them to see that the other side didn't have horns. And but I attended the first AAPOR meeting, which was Williamstown in 1947. And boy, you could see the problems right there. My father and a number of the other commercial people were a little unhappy about the accommodations and sleeping in college dorms and that kind of thing. And the academics were a little unhappy about having to spend any money at all to go to a meeting. And so we had elements of a problem just in that. But it worked. It has, I don't mean there aren't some frictions between academics and commercial people, but not like there used to be. Not like there used to be. It's been a very good, Harry Field was right.
Well, but I think it's probably time to move on to the next major event in polling history, and probably the major event in polling history. Here you are, new to the firm, a couple of years on the job, and 1948 election happens.
Yeah, I've always said that my election polling fame began with '48.
What happened?
Well, you get about as many different opinions as to what happened as the number of people you talk to. I've got very firm opinions on what happened. I may be wrong, but I got very firm opinions on what happened. I don't think there was any major last-minute swing to Truman at all. I think it was all a matter of turnout. For the first time since polling had come in, the polls said it's going to be a Republican. And I think the Republicans went out and played golf, and because they knew the polls were right. They'd proven it in 3 previous elections. And they didn't go to the polls. Conversely, the labor unions, for the first time since they'd been in power, were threatened. They had the prospect of losing to a Republican candidate. So they really beat the bushes to get out the vote. Now, you could say this is just theory, but we did a study after 1948, not an interviewing study, we did that too, but we did a study in which we took 10 cities and we arranged the precincts by rental level, the census supplied average rental level of housing or sale price of housing by precinct. So we could arrange them from the richest precincts to the poorest precincts, and we did. And then we looked at the vote in 44 versus the vote in 48. And when I say we looked at the vote, I mean we looked at whether people voted or not at who they voted for. We couldn't get at that. But what we found was that the turnout level in 44 was almost identical to 48. So that says it isn't turnout, it's the same. But the composition of it was very different. The richest precincts voted about half the strength that they had in 44. And the upper middle voted, you know, 2/3 or 3/4 of what they had in 44. The biggest group, what we call the C economic level, sort of the average American kind of guy, was unchanged. It was almost identical in both years. But the poor doubled. And there it was, right there. It was not same overall turnout, but a much poorer voter in 48 than in 44. And poorer voters were Democrats. Richer voters were Republicans. Now, I've also got some survey evidence that I think points to the same thing, although other people think it points to how lousy our studies were. We did a study right after the election. I worked on the questionnaire, and I was out testing the questionnaire on Thursday after Tuesday. Quite an experience. But anyway, when we got that study done, we had Dewey elected again. We asked people, did you happen to vote in last Tuesday's election? And if they said yes, we asked them who they voted for and named the 4 candidates. And we again had Dewey winning. Now, not by as much as he had won in the pre-election polls, but still winning. This is after he had lost. Well, and we also had 3 out of 4 people saying they voted. And the voting, or 80% saying they had voted, and only 60% had in fact voted. So some 20% were telling us they voted when they hadn't. And there's pretty good reason with all the other stuff to believe it was the more or less fat cats who were embarrassed by the fact they hadn't voted, but hadn't voted.
So conventional wisdom is that polling organizations stop polling too early.
I think there's some truth to that, but I think they would have missed it anyway, because ours after the election had Dewey elected. And the results were known by then, but we still had Dewey elected. I never was all that happy with the Social Science Research Council's analysis, because I think they let too many people into it. The sampling people all wanted to say the sampling was quota sampling that was the problem. Other people wanted to say it was timing. Other people wanted to say this or that or the other thing. And the report sort of became a collection for every theory there was, with some kind of justification given to it by SSRC. But I think the real, not the only, but the real thing was turnout. Not the size of the turnout, but the composition of it.
What could the polls have done to get it closer before, in hindsight now?
Well, we did do some experimentation. We had a tougher problem in a way than either Gallup or Crossley, because they used the conventional, if the election were being held tomorrow, who would you vote for? X on the Republican ticket or Y on the Democratic? That kind of a question. We never had. My father was always convinced that too many people back in the 30s were reluctant. First of all, they didn't understand polls. They wondered whether this was their employer checking up on them. And there used to be signs then, if you vote Democratic on Tuesday, don't come to work on Wednesday. So what we did was to have a 4-part attitude scale. I say we, I wasn't in the firm. And we said, which of these 4 statements comes closest to describing your feelings? And the 4 statements, I can't remember the verbatim wording of them, but the first one in effect said, FDR is God. He can do no wrong. And the second one said, well, Roosevelt has made some mistakes. On balance, he's done more good than harm. And the third, and that's almost verbatim, the third was the reverse of it. While Roosevelt has done some good things, on balance, he's done more harm than good. And the fourth one is, Roosevelt's a dirty, no good, you know what. That was not the wording, but that was the idea. And that let people who were reluctant to admit how they were going to vote go into one of the middle positions, the moderate positions. But it tipped, they could, there was no one, I don't know how to describe it. Roosevelt's done as much good as bad. There was no such position. So they had to say, well, he's done some bad things. On balance, he's done more good than harm, or the other way around. And we classified those as Roosevelt voters. And it worked out beautifully. My father was always convinced that's why we were the closest. Well, in 48, that was out the window. Roosevelt wasn't even alive, much less the issue. And we had 4 candidates, it wasn't Roosevelt versus the other guy, as it had been. So we did a lot of experimental work in the spring and summer to trying to figure out how the hell are we going to do this. And I wrote one question that with hindsight I think might have made us right when everyone else was wrong. I'm so glad we didn't do it, because we would have had swell heads like you couldn't imagine. And our downfall would have come next. But what I did was to write a 4-part attitude statement, but not a scale. I cast each of the 4 candidates in his most favorable light. Dewey was the young DA who, the new broom that swept clean and would get rid of 20 years of crime and corruption. Truman was the inheritor of Roosevelt's bad. Henry Wallace was the only one with new and different ideas in an otherwise Tweedledee, Tweedledum election. And Strom Thurmond was the only one who had any concern for states' rights. Now, when we asked that, we tried this and several other approaches on large samples. When we asked that question, we got a stronger Truman result. We didn't have Truman winning. This was something like June or July. We didn't have Truman winning, but we had him much closer to winning than any of the other approaches we tried. And in fact, as we looked at it, and this includes me, we decided we had it tied too close to FDR. That FDR was not the candidate, it was Truman. But we had it almost so that if you didn't pick Truman, you were turning on FDR. So we didn't use that. I think we might have been right, but we would have been right for the wrong reason. I still think it was composition, as I said.
Your firm at the time, 48 election, had made the decision to respond to it immediately, and the response was quite interesting and very
Oh,
different than
you're
some of
talking
the
about
others. The outcome of the 48 election.
We, at that time, in 48, I mentioned the Fortune Survey, which is what our original ones were. But in 48, we had a syndicated column like Gallup did. And my father was due to write a column the day after the election to be printed the following day on why we were so right, except it didn't come out that way. And we met about 8 in the morning. We were up all night. We met about 8 in the morning in my father's office. All the partners, and Eric Hodgins, who was a regular consultant of ours. He's the guy who wrote, well, he was an editor of Fortune magazine at one point. He's the one who wrote Mr. Blanding's Builds His Dream House, Blanding's Way, and so forth. Great guy. Anyway, we all met about 8 o'clock and to discuss what my father's column for the next day should be. Well, it was a raging battle. And I was sort of in a minority. I did have some silent, at least one silent supporter. But I said, look, we blew it. We got to say we blew it. And other people were saying, well, you know, this is the first time in so many elections, and the average error of those elections was only 3.8% or something like that. And we really weren't that bad. The timing, we should have polled later. And I said, well, I think that's evading the real issue. The real issue is we blew it. About this time, it was about 9 o'clock, I guess, and Eric Hodges got up and turned to Carolyn Crucius and said, lady, and then turned to the rest of us and said, and gentlemen, I think I have the sense of the meeting. If you'll excuse me, I'll go write a draft of the column. Well, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about, the sense of the meeting. There was no sense of the meeting. It was all over the lot. But Eric left, and at 10 o'clock, came back. We had enough people in this so that an original in 4 carbons wouldn't cover it. And we had folds with carbon paper in between that it was before Thermofax or Xerox or anything of that kind. So Eric came in with 2 sets of the carbon things and passed them around. And I started to read it. And I was absolutely delighted. The opening sentences, I remember, and I think this is about verbatim, was, we were wrong. We couldn't have been more wrong. We intend to find out why. That was the first paragraph. And then it went into, and I was delighted. And I watched as everyone else read, and finally everybody had finished reading, and my father said, Eric, I think that's great. Let's run it. And all of the controversy was resolved with that. And I thought we ought to do it because it was the only honest thing to do. But I discovered there was another reason for doing it, which had never even occurred to me. Months and even years later, I found people saying, you were the only people that were right in 1948, weren't you? And I said, no, we were as wrong as anyone else. Oh, I thought you were right. But, you know, when you say, okay, I did it, what does anyone say then? Well, don't do it again. I mean, that's about all they can say. They can't say you're a liar, you've told it the way it was. So it didn't happen.
There was another instance where you faced a similar sort of situation later in your career. We're going to jump ahead a little bit.
Oh, yeah,
to 1992.
Yes.
In the American Jewish Committee.
Yeah. Well, the study happened in 1992. It was published then. And I was being, well, I won't say avoided, but the new team, it was known that I was going to retire pretty soon. And the new team was spreading things around that I had normally done. And so I discovered this in the New York Times write-up. And it said that a Roper poll had shown that, I forget exactly how they phrased it, but they said it had shown that 1 out of 5 Americans didn't think the Holocaust ever happened, and another 13% didn't know whether it had happened or not. So you had someplace between 20% and 33% who either think it never happened or don't know whether it ever happened. And I couldn't believe that. And I talked with the people who were directly involved in it, and they had been concerned about the fact we were being asked to ask questions that either the AJC had asked on its own studies or other organizations had asked, and they wanted us to do the same thing. We had the person who was principally responsible had reason to be unsure of their objectivity and their ability to judge questions that well. So he went over them, and he got to this one question. This was the offending question. And he wanted to balance it. He thought it was unclear the way it was, and he wanted to balance it up. Well, he balanced it up, but in the process, he made it so goddamn complicated that if you knew exactly what you thought about whether the Holocaust happened, and you did too, but it was the opposite way, I'll bet you that at least one of you would be wrong in the answers you would have given to this question. I had to stop and think, wait a minute now. If I say this, what am I saying? And it took me about 3 minutes to figure out what was the answer I had to give to say, I believe the Holocaust happened. It got into double negatives. It was a mess. And we called the client and told them we thought there was a serious problem. Well, they didn't see a problem. And I said, well, I see a problem, and I think we've got to get to the bottom of it. We commissioned Bruskin. That was the name of the company. I guess Bruskin's now part of Roper, but they weren't then. We commissioned them to ask 2 versions, I think it was 2 versions of this question. The question as we asked it that produced this 34%. And as we rewrote it afterwards to make it a proper question. And with the rewritten question, they only got 8% who, I forget it was 8% who knew the Holocaust didn't happen, or 8% who knew or weren't sure. But anyway, it was 8%. It wasn't up in the 20 to 33 range. Well, the client's reaction was, well, you took one question, you took it out of context, and the only way that would have any meaning was if you did the whole study over again and changed the one question. And we don't want to do that. Well, I did want to do it. And finally, we agreed we would pay for the whole thing. But they had to agree to publish it, whatever it showed. And by that time, we were into 94, and the issue had pumped up quite a bit, partly because of me, but partly because of outside critics. And I was asked to appear at the AAPOR conference. I tried to get the client to appear. They would have nothing to do with it. And they told me not to appear. And I said, well, I'm going to appear. And they said, well, you may regret it. So we had the results, actually, when I gave the talk. But they had the release rights, and they had all spring to decide how they wanted to release it and so forth. They had to release it, but how they released it, what interpretation they put on it, they had till all spring to do that. So I hit it at what I expected the results to show, even though I already knew what they were. And I've never been quite as unhappy in my life. This was sort of my, almost the first crack out of the gun was the 48 election. That's the way I started my career. And this is the way I was going to end it, saying, yeah, we blew it. But I made the presentation at AAPOR, and both the New York Times and the Associated Press gave a wonderfully favorable reactions to what I had said. And the final analysis, 1% thought the Holocaust never happened. And there was, I forget the percentage, who didn't know, but it was higher than that, but it wasn't. It was way the hell below the 33%, 34%. It was a kind of figure that I would have expected. I didn't expect it to be as low as 1, but that's the way it came out.
And did your client ultimately release those
Well,
results?
they had to, because of the New York Times article, because of the Associated Press story, and because it just seemed like a much more logical result to an awful lot of people, awful lot of critics. So, I survived that one.
But
I survived it the same way, by telling it like it was, not by trying to make something out of it that it wasn't.
But you've been involved in a lot of different kinds of projects. I know we've talked about consumer and market research and political public policy. Can you give us some ideas of some of the studies that were particularly noteworthy in your mind, or exciting, or particularly creative?
Oh, boy. Well, I suppose one of the greatest studies we ever did, it was my father's idea, although he immersed me in it pretty heavily, was a very simple thing, to find out what advertising does. Not an easy thing.
No.
But we made a lot of input, and we had a multiple group. It was a very expensive study, particularly for those days. And we had, let's see, who did we have as clients? We had Atlantic Richfield was one. Standard Oil of New Jersey was another. Trying to remember, I think Ford was part of it, part of the sponsors. J. Walter Thompson was heavily involved because they had a couple of the clients that were financial supporters. That was, I think, a memorable study. And I don't know, beyond that, I mean, the ones that always intrigued me were the ones that were different, offbeat. And what do I mean by that? Well, the study we did for John Chafee when he was running for governor of Rhode Island, one of his backers knew my father, and he called my father and said, Elmo, we haven't talked in 20 years or whatever, but he said, I wonder if you could do something for us. We want to know what we should be talking about in the final 3 weeks of the campaign. You suppose you could do a survey for us? He said, we don't have much money. Yeah, like $1,500, that's what they had. And my father said, my son Bud has rented the Chafee household in Matunic for years, doesn't know John Chafee, the candidate, but he knows his father and mother and so forth. And let me see if he'd be interested. So that was put in front of me. And I thought, my God, how do we do this? And we had a time pressure on us, but we also had a money pressure on us. And I hit on the idea of sending two of my top people up there to go to shopping malls. Any place they could find them in Rhode Island, shopping malls. And stop people and ask them if they voted, I forget which year this was now, but let's say it was
62. 62
Okay.
election.
Stop people and say, did you vote in the 1960 election for governor between Noddy and I forget who the Republican was? And if they said yes, then we said, who'd you vote for? Noddy or the other guy? And then we said, today, John Chafee is running against so-and-so. Who do you think you'll vote for? And I told my two colleagues, anytime you get an indication of a switcher, potential switcher, voted Republican then, I'm going to vote Democratic now, or I voted Democratic then, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do now, continue the interview. But if it's consistent, then and now, thank them very much and move on to somebody else, because we've got to get this done fast. Well, we got the results. We got the switchers. We got the people who had voted, and it was something over, it was about 300 people. And 36 of them were indicated switchers. One of them from the Republicans to the Democrats, and the other 35 from the Democrats to the Republicans. Well, that was more than, that was just about a 10% or 11% indicated shift. And I ran for the record book and found out that the Democrat who was then in office had only won by 8%. And of course I had a lousy sample because it was a convenient sample of people on 2 days in shopping centers in Rhode Island. But I thought, boy, if this thing is anything like right, they could win this election. And that was the first time anybody had ever said it. They knew they were cooked grease, and everybody else knew they were cooked. But when we talked about it, I told them, I said, I think you've got a real possibility of winning. Winning, you know, what's that? And then we also got into what they could talk about in the closing weeks. We had about 5 or 6 scenarios that they had come up with. And one of them, which might have been the juiciest one, was also, in my opinion, the most dangerous, and they thought so too. That was the fact there were reported rumors of the governor's chauffeur sleeping with his daughter. And that would have been a nice juicy thing, but it also was a very dangerous thing. They didn't pick that. I forget what they did pick. And he won by 398 votes after the absentee ballots were counted.
Wow.
Now, I know our survey was good for 500 votes. I'm just absolutely certain of it. So I think you can say there's a case where a lousy sample with a lousy questionnaire and a lousy design nevertheless did the job. I also told Chafee was a wonderful, I got to know him later, and he was a wonderful man, just a terrific man. But he talked with a sort of cultivated Rhode Island accent, and he sounded a little bit like he had a frog stuck in his throat. And he talked slowly. And partly because he didn't have a hell of a lot of money, but mostly because he talked slowly. I said, I think what you ought to do is go on radio at commuting hours and do 10 and 20-second spots, nothing longer than that. You have to pick one subject that you're going to talk about, and only one. Don't scatter your shots. Pick one thing, go with it in 10 and 20-second spots. Well, the 10 and 20-second spots was to make Chafee talk faster than he would otherwise talk. And he did. I heard, in fact, my wife and I heard a couple of the commercials when we were driving through Rhode Island at the time. They were pretty damn good. And so he won, and now that's a study I've always been proud of. If I put that up for any kind of industry award, it would have gotten knocked down on every basis you could think of. But it did the job. So that's the kind of thing I like to do. Another one was the studies we did for RCA. The total market for television in this country at that time, and I think I'm talking about 1948, maybe it was even earlier than that, was 8 markets: New York metro area, Boston, Philadelphia, and I think, and there were some others, and I think it included St. Louis, Missouri. And RCA wanted to do a study, or the head of RCA wanted to do a study to find out how fast television was growing and how suitable their product was for consumer demand and so on and so forth. The question is, how do you design a sample? Because new markets were coming on every few months. So you design it for this year, and it's not good for next year. Well, I decided what we could do is make it as national, every year, make it as national as television was. And the additions could be significant, but they could never be more than maybe 20% of the total sample. So you could take that 20% and put it aside and compare the remaining 80% of this year's study to the whole 100% of last year's study, and see what a year's passage of time had done, with no change in markets. Maybe change within markets because there were more owners now, and the owners might be different than the previous owners. But basically, you could see what happened in those 8 markets in a year. And that's what we did. Now, then we could look at the 20% and see whether those markets, the new markets, had different appetites and different desires and so forth. And that was really quite a successful series. And one of the things, then the FCC put a freeze on new channels. There was a thing called co-channel interference, where people in, let's say in New Jersey, would be picking up the New York station primarily, but they'd also get Philadelphia seeping in. And they'd get the audio from one and the video from the other, and it was a mess. And so the FCC suspended new stations coming on the air until they got this problem ironed out. Well, that was a couple of years, maybe 3, I can't remember how long. Then the question became, what's going to happen now? By the time the freeze was lifted, there were something like 10 or 12 or 14 stations ready to go on the air in new markets. And what were they going to do? Were they going to do the slow building that the existing markets had done, or were they going to catch up overnight because they'd been deprived of this for 2 or 3 years? So we did that. And we found they were going to catch up overnight. And we told RCA, put every bit of product you could possibly put out in these new market areas, because they're going to go like wildfire. And RCA did. And they ended up with 50% of the sales in those first markets, because not because they had a 50% demand by then. At one point they did, but they were down to more like 25%. But they had the product. If you wanted a new television set,
Was there?
If you wanted something else, probably it was out of stock. But an RCA you could get. Well, that paid for the whole series of studies, really.
Sure.
Just the sales they made on that. And we did some interesting cabinet works studies for them, and specifically showing that people really didn't want a piece of furniture with doors on it that they had to open to see the screen. And then, well, take a situation like that where you got a chair, I mean, let's say that was the set. Then you have to move the two chairs to get the doors open wide enough so you could see it. And then when you close it up, you turn it and do it again. And RCA was convinced that people wanted furniture, but that the only reason these ball picture tubes were selling was price. Well, price certainly was one factor, but also people found it much more practical. And you know, you don't put your toaster in some protective covering so nobody knows what it is. If you want a toaster, you put it where you toast your, same idea. So that got them off this cabinet kick that they were on and saved them a lot of money. So that's the kind of studies that I find particularly
But
interesting.
could you talk a little bit about the Roper reports and the beginnings of that?
Well, Roper reports, yeah, that's one of my proudest efforts. I was the father of Roper reports, and Shirley Wilkins, who was the president of the firm at that time, was the mother. And we were the only two people that really thought this had something. And the idea was to come up with a sort of a roadmap for public relations people. Everybody else in business had a roadmap. Salespeople had sales figures and what competitors were doing and so forth. And engineers had engineering reports and repair reports, and so they had all that stuff. But the public relations people had nothing. They were sort of, which way is the wind blowing? And we decided we'd give them a roadmap of what changing consumer tastes and preferences, public tastes and preferences were, so that they could figure out how to gear their operation into what people were looking for. We had pretty good success with public relations people, but not as big as I ever thought we should. What we found was that top management had an interest in it, whether public relations were or not, and also that the marketing research department wanted it. And I've thought about it several times since. Really, in many ways, it was more like the Fortune Quarterly Survey that my father did for Fortune magazine back in the 30s than it was to anything else I could think of. And we had competitors come out, we didn't know they had these ideas, but they came out on the marketplace before we did. And that worried us some. But we pretty much are about the only survivor left, I think, in that general field. There was the Yankelovich Monitor, and there was another Yankelovich one, and there were several others, but they, one by one, sort of dropped by the wayside. And ORC had the, what they call it, ORC Caravan, I guess it was called. Oh, no, the ORC Index, that's what it was, the ORC Index. And that's still going, I believe. But the Roper reports was a technological problem because we were doing a survey a month. And we wanted to get this survey out within 2 months of doing it so it wasn't invalidated by the next survey. Also, we couldn't cover all the subject matter we wanted to cover in any one issue, so we had to hopscotch. I think it was a great series, maybe not as great as the Fortune Quarterly surveys, but It was a great series of studies, and I think it's gone too commercial now. I don't think it doesn't do the same thing that we originally had in mind. Now it puts in questions that some junior person in an ad agency wants the answer to because his boss asked him. And so it's sort of, you get 3 questions this month, you get 1, you get 4. And that's not the way it should be, in my view.
Bud, we're going to talk a little bit now about balanced research and quality analysis. I know that you've voiced a concern that a lot of people call the margin of error, consider the margin of error total error rather than sampling error. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ideas that you've had about the other attributes of surveys that enter into total error?
Well, I think the margin of error is, of course, just sampling error, but most people don't know that, or many people don't know it. And I think the focus on that does exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It doesn't say this survey is subject to some error because of sample and other things. Instead it says, you could count on these results to within plus or minus 3.2 percentage points. And that's ridiculous, because if it's one of the 5, it's beyond that, just on sample. And then there's the whole question of, does the question make any sense? You answer one question one way, and you'd answer a seemingly similar question quite differently, very possibly. That doesn't show up at all, and it has nothing to do with it. So I've always been opposed to margin of error, because I think instead of warning people of errors and the reasons for them, it tells them you could count on this to within 3 percentage points. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the way we should go. Right now, I think our whole completion rate problem, if you want to call it that, is the real problem. We had problems in 46 when I went into it, but I think the industry's got much greater problems today. And the big problem is calling me on the phone at dinner hour and wanting to ask me just a few questions, which take 30 minutes. I think as long as that goes on, and if the bona fide research organizations cannot separate themselves from the trash that's going through under the guise of research, then I think the whole industry is damned. When I say industry, I mean academia as well, because it's the method that's being attacked. I think I've been saying this for years, and I'm beginning to see this. I'm finally getting a few supporters. I think we've got to go back to personal interviews. Telephone won't do it. Internet won't do it. Email won't do it. It's got to have a personal quality to it that makes people willing to give up their time. And I think that the most pressing job for the head of any research operation today, academic or commercial, is how to make the interviewing, how to put the interviewing experience into a setting that makes the whole thing attractive to people rather than an annoyance. I don't know all the answers to it, but certainly personal interviewing is one of them. That one-on-one kind of thing is got appeal. People will respond to that, where they won't to someone who jangles the phone at 2 minutes before it's time to have dinner, and then has a surly, illiterate person on the other end asking stupid questions. It's got to be made. the more I think, I think it's got to be made a social experience that people like having lunch out, or like seeing the neighbors in the spring, or, you know, something's got, I'm not just talking about the interview itself, I'm talking about the setting, whether it should be some kind of almost like a club, not an exclusive club. I don't mean a club that you can't get into because you don't make as much money as I do, or you can't get into because you don't have as many degrees as I do, but something that is enjoyable, something that you like and look forward to. I think until we do that, the industry is facing a very serious problem. I'm convinced that it can be solved. I don't have all the answers as to how. But if it is not solved, I think the industry as we've known it's going to be, it'll survive, but it's going to survive with worse and worse results every time we go out.
Was there a problem with response rate when you started your career, in the late 40s, 50s?
Oh, there's always been that kind of course, then the criticism was against samples that had quota elements in them. It didn't matter. Couldn't even compute a response rate if you got quota elements.
Right.
But no, it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse as the two-wage earner family has increased. You don't have anybody at home half the time, except maybe the kids. And people are more pressed for time. They're holding a second job. They're trying to be a father and a mother, and the whole divorce thing is part of the problem too. I don't have time for some idiot who wants to know how much head I want on my beer, particularly since I don't drink beer. It's got to be put into some kind of a setting that makes it desirable. And I emphasize desirable, not necessarily prestigious, but something that I enjoy doing. And this breakfast group I belong to comes to mind as this is a group of flyers that meets every Thursday. Flyers or people who were interested in aviation. Meets every Thursday in Orleans at a restaurant. It has no officers, it has no constitution, it has no membership requirements, it has no rules of any kind, except breakfast is served every Thursday morning at 8 o'clock and you pay for your own breakfast. And it's growing. The attendance is almost twice as high now as when I started going to it 3 years ago. And it's been going for 10 years. Because it's an enjoyable experience. Now, it might not be enjoyable to somebody who wasn't interested in aviation, so maybe you need themes, maybe you need a garden setting for one kind of person, an economics or business. I don't know. And you got also the problem of, will people who are downscaled, both economically and academically, will they talk frankly in a room with fat cats and PhDs? Do you have to segment it that way somehow and then get some kind of a modular design that says, well, this subgroup of the population, PhDs who do this, that, and the other thing, is 2.1% of the total. We got to put it into this total and weight it down to 2.1. I don't know what the answer is. I think I do know what the problem is. Until interviewing is an enjoyable experience, or the surroundings of the interview are an enjoyable experience, the industry, the field, has great problems.
I think the field is going to require some creative individuals like yourself.
Well, I think it's going to require some creative individuals. It's going to require some money. That's why I'm hopeful that the Roper Center endowment will grow, and that the AAPOR endowment will grow. I'm happy to have had some hand in causing that to happen, and I'm planning to leave both of them some money. Not too soon, I hope.
No,
No.
we hope not.
But we want to thank you for sharing this time with us today,
I've enjoyed it.
and for contributing to
Rambled
the
on.
AAPOR Heritage Series. But more importantly, we want to thank you for your leadership in shaping this field that we've been involved in, and the lessons in integrity that you've talked about today and you've demonstrated throughout your career. I think those are important lessons that all practitioners.
Well, I think it has been a neglected field. I am concerned that the heads of research organizations pay much too much attention to the client, much too much attention to profits, much too much attention to everything except the basic guts of it, which is the interview, or the situation that produces the interview. I think field directors get a raw deal. And don't bother me with that. I've got other problems. You're not going to have them soon. All the others will be gone. I've enjoyed it.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.